You know what they say about getting everything you thought you wanted? Sometimes it comes with a price tag you never saw coming. Anyway, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy my stories, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. I'm Alana, I'm 29, and I just became a doctor. You'd think that would be the happiest moment of my life, right? Well, it was supposed to be. But let me tell you how I got here, because the journey was a lot messier than anyone realizes. 8 years ago, I met Ross at this little campus coffee shop where I was working during my pre-med years. He was 23 then, doing construction work and saving every penny for some grand plan to start his own business. At first, I found his ambition kind of attractive. He had this intensity about him, always talking about building something lasting, whether it was houses or relationships. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. The guy was obsessed with permanence in a world where everything changes. When I got accepted into medical school, Ross immediately started picking up extra shifts to help with my expenses. Did I ask him to do this? No. Did I stop him? Also, no. I mean, if someone wants to support your dreams, who are you to argue? He'd come home covered in sawdust and concrete dust, exhausted from working 12-hour days, but he'd still ask about my classes and try to plan little date nights around my study schedule. The thing about Ross was that he was always so needy for attention. Like, I get it, relationships require effort, but I was literally training to save lives. His constant questions about my day and his attempts at romance started feeling suffocating rather than sweet. Here I was learning about human anatomy and disease processes, and he wanted to discuss what we should watch on Netflix. By my third year, I was barely tolerating his presence. Don't get me wrong, I never said anything cruel to his face. I'm not that kind of person. But between us, I started seeing him for what he really was. This guy who was content working with his hands while I was elevating myself to an entirely different level. When he'd come home exhausted and dirty, I'd feel this wave of disgust rather than gratitude. Like, couldn't he at least shower before trying to hug me? I started making little comments here and there. Nothing too harsh, just observations about how different our worlds were becoming. When he'd talk about his construction projects, I'd mention how I was learning to perform actual surgery. When he'd complain about his back hurting from physical labor, I'd point out that mental exhaustion was so much worse. He started getting quieter, more withdrawn, which I took as him finally understanding his place in my life. The truth is, I was already fantasizing about my future as a successful doctor. I'd imagine myself at medical conferences, dating other professionals, having intellectual conversations that didn't revolve around building codes and lumber prices. Ross felt like this anchor dragging me down, keeping me tethered to a version of myself I was trying to outgrow. Medical school got more demanding, and I used that stress as a weapon whenever Ross tried to address problems in our relationship. If he complained about us never spending time together, I'd tear up and talk about how overwhelmed I was. If he suggested we needed to reconnect, I'd shut down completely and give him the silent treatment until he apologized for being insensitive to my pressure. I mean, how could he possibly understand what I was going through? He spent his days hammering nails while I was memorizing every bone in the human body. The frozen dinners and canceled plans weren't sacrifices in my mind. They were just the natural order of things. My career came first, and if he couldn't handle that, maybe he wasn't the right person for me. During my final year, I started researching divorce procedures. I wasn't planning anything immediate, but I wanted to know my options. I calculated how we could divide our assets, looked into what I'd be entitled to, and basically treated our marriage like a business partnership that was about to dissolve. Ross seemed to sense something was changing and tried even harder to connect with me, which only made everything worse. His attempts at romance felt pathetic. This sweaty construction worker trying to impress a future doctor with gas station flowers and chain restaurant dinners. I started staying out later after study groups, sometimes grabbing drinks with my classmates and venting about feeling tied down to someone who couldn't understand my world. My fellow students were incredibly supportive. They'd make subtle comments about how I shouldn't let anyone hold me back, how I deserved someone who could match my ambition, how medical school was the perfect time to reassess all your relationships. They never said anything directly about Ross, but the message was clear. Successful doctors don't stay married to construction workers. I began treating Ross like hired help around the house. He'd handle all the household responsibilities while I focused on my studies and clinical rotations. When he'd try to share stories about his work or problems with difficult contractors, I'd barely listen, internally rolling my eyes at his trivial concerns compared to my life and death medical training. The graduation ceremony was supposed to be our moment, but I'd already decided it would be my moment alone. I'd spent weeks preparing for this conversation, filling out divorce papers, consulting with a lawyer, and rehearsing my speech about needing a fresh start. I'd even calculated exactly how to divide our assets in a way that would benefit me most. Sitting in that auditorium, watching Ross clap enthusiastically when they called my name, I felt nothing but irritation. This wasn't our achievement, this was mine. He'd been helpful during the process, sure, but that chapter of my life was over. I was a doctor now, and I wanted to start fresh without any dead weight dragging me down. When I handed him those divorce papers in the parking lot, I expected drama. I expected begging, tears, maybe even anger that would justify my decision to my watching colleagues. What I got was the most anticlimactic moment of my life. Ross just looked at the papers, looked at me, and asked if I was serious. Dead serious, I told him. Look, I don't need you anymore. I have my degree, I have job offers, I have a future. You were helpful during school, but that chapter of my life is over. I used the word helpful deliberately. That's all he'd been, a support system like financial aid or a study group. Now that I was graduating, I didn't need that kind of assistance anymore. What shocked me was how calmly he took it. He pulled out a pen and signed every single page without even reading the details. Right there in front of my medical school colleagues, he ended our marriage with the same casual efficiency I'd used to start the conversation. Congratulations on your graduation and your divorce, he said, handing the papers back to me. Then he just walked away, left me standing there with my diploma in one hand and our signed divorce papers in the other, while my classmates started whispering among themselves. One of them asked, "Who was that guy, and why did he just walk away from his own car?" I kept expecting him to come back, to fight for us, to show some emotion about ending 8 years of marriage, but he just disappeared around the corner, leaving me with a very public breakup scene that I definitely hadn't planned for. 3 days later, I discovered that Ross had vanished completely, not just from our apartment, but from the entire state. While I was expecting him to come crawling back with apologies and flowers, he was executing the most thorough disappearing act I'd ever seen. The first sign of trouble came when I tried to pay rent. Turns out the lease was in his name only, and the landlord doesn't accept I'm going to be a doctor as legal tender. When the electricity got shut off 3 days later, followed by the internet, I finally understood that Ross hadn't been dead weight after all. He'd been the foundation holding everything together. My starting salary as a resident was barely more than what Ross had been making in construction. Except now, I had 6-figure student loan debt hanging over my head. The apartment I'd claimed in the divorce papers became a financial nightmare within 6 months. Without Ross's income supporting the rent, utilities, and groceries, I burned through my savings before my first paycheck even arrived. I ended up taking on 2 roommates just to make ends meet, sharing the space I'd been so excited to have all to myself. These roommates, by the way, were not impressed when they discovered I'd divorced my husband immediately after graduation. They made it very clear they thought I was a selfish person who'd used Ross and thrown him away the moment I didn't need him anymore. My work schedule as a resident was brutal: 80-hour weeks, overnight shifts, being on call during weekends. I'd planned to enjoy my newfound freedom. The social life I'd envisioned as a successful single doctor turned into catching naps between shifts and living on hospital cafeteria food and energy drinks. Meanwhile, my attempts to track down Ross became increasingly desperate. I tried calling his old job, but they claimed they'd never heard of him. I contacted his family members, but they all gave me the same cold response. They didn't know anyone by that name. I even hired a private investigator with money I couldn't afford to spend, but every lead went nowhere. It was like Ross had erased himself from existence, taking all evidence of our marriage with him. The man I dismissed as unambitious and simple-minded had managed to disappear so completely that even professionals couldn't find him. 2 years into my residency, my car broke down. Major engine problems that would cost more to fix than the car was worth. In the past, this would have been Ross's problem to solve. He'd have figured out the financing, negotiated with mechanics, maybe even borrowed money from family if necessary. Now, I was facing it alone with maxed out credit cards and no savings. I ended up taking public transportation for 3 months before finally qualifying for a loan on a used car with payments that ate up a significant chunk of my already tight budget. The whole experience triggered something in me. This realization that I'd thrown away my entire support system for a career that wasn't living up to my expectations. That's when I started my real search for Ross. I abused my access to medical databases, searching hospital employment records across multiple states. It was a long shot that shouldn't have worked, but it did. A routine physical he'd gotten through his employer's health insurance program showed up in my search. The hospital was in Dallas, and the employment was listed with a major construction firm. After 3 years of searching, I finally had a location. I took time off work I couldn't afford to lose and drove 16 hours to Dallas. I found his employer and sat in their lobby for hours, spinning some story about a family emergency. When that didn't work, I spent the weekend driving around the city, looking for his truck in apartment complexes and restaurant parking lots. I posted on neighborhood Facebook groups and Craigslist asking for help finding my estranged husband. The responses were brutal. Most people told me that if my husband wanted to be found, he wouldn't have disappeared so thoroughly. Several women shared their own stories about ex-husbands who'd gone no contact, and the consensus was clear. This level of avoidance meant serious damage had been done. I finally got his address from a private investigator and sat outside his house for an entire day. When he came home and saw me there, he went straight into his garage without acknowledging my presence. I spent hours ringing his doorbell and knocking, yelling through the door about how we needed to talk like adults. The police officer who eventually showed up was professional but firm. Ross had made it clear he wanted no contact with me, and I needed to respect that boundary. Watching the officer escort me away from the house felt like the final nail in the coffin of any hope I had for reconciliation, but I wasn't ready to give up. A few weeks later, I cornered him at a hardware store. He looked different, healthier, more confident, like he'd been thriving without me. When I begged him for 5 minutes to explain and apologize, his response cut deeper than I'd expected. "You had 8 years of chances," he said. "You used them all up in a parking lot 3 years ago." I tried to explain that I'd been stressed, that medical school had overwhelmed me, that I'd said things I didn't mean. But Ross just leaned against his truck and crossed his arms. "So, let me understand this," he said. "When you thought you were going to be wealthy and successful, you threw me away like garbage. Now that reality hit and you're struggling, suddenly I'm the best thing that ever happened to you." The worst part was that he was right. I had valued what he provided more than who he was as a person, but I couldn't admit that, even to myself. "We had something good before medical school took over everything," I insisted. "We can have that again." Ross almost laughed. "We never had anything good. You had 8 years of being my personal support system while you chased your dream. I had 8 years of free financial and emotional labor while you figured out your career." When I told him I loved him, that I'd always loved him, he just shook his head. "You valued what I provided. There's a difference." Then he dropped the bomb that shattered whatever was left of my hope. "I'm engaged to someone. We're getting married in September." The words hit me like a physical blow. Engaged to someone else? While I'd been desperately searching for him, he'd been building a new life with another woman. "But we're still married," I stammered. "No, we're not. You divorced me, remember? Signed papers and everything." He handed me 2 things before getting in his truck and driving away: a restraining order and a wedding invitation. The invitation had his name and some woman named Claire printed in elegant script along with a September date and Dallas venue information. "I want you to understand that I'm not just moving on from you," he said. "I've already moved on completely." That was 8 months ago. I never contacted Ross again. The restraining order made sure of that. But I heard through mutual acquaintances that his wedding was beautiful, that his new wife appreciates everything about him that I'd taken for granted, and that he's happier than he ever was with me. Meanwhile, I'm still sharing an apartment with roommates who barely tolerate me, working 80-hour weeks to pay off debt that feels insurmountable, and coming home to an empty bed every night. My dream career turned out to be a nightmare of exhaustion and financial stress, and the man who would have supported me through anything is now supporting someone else. The thing that bothers me most isn't that Ross found happiness without me. It's that he found it so easily, like our 8 years together meant nothing to him. If he'd really loved me, wouldn't he have fought harder? Wouldn't he have waited for me to figure things out? I mean, sure, I made some mistakes. I probably could have been more appreciative of his sacrifices, but he knew what he was signing up for when he married someone with medical school ambitions. He knew my career would come first. The fact that he gave up on us so easily just proves that he never really understood what it meant to be married to someone with real goals. Look, I'm not saying I was perfect, but Ross wasn't exactly husband of the year either. He was clingy, needy, and completely unable to understand the pressure I was under. Maybe if he'd been stronger, more confident, more supportive of my dreams, things would have worked out differently. But here's the thing. I'm a doctor now. I achieved everything I set out to achieve. Yeah, it's harder than I expected, and yeah, I'm struggling financially, but I'm saving lives every day. That has to count for something, right? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled the divorce differently. Maybe if I'd been gentler, more grateful for his support, he would have been willing to work things out later when I was ready. But then I remember how he looked at me in that hardware store parking lot, like I was a stranger, like our entire relationship had been a mistake. He was grateful to escape. The truth is, Ross was never strong enough to handle being married to someone like me. He needed someone simple, someone who would make him the center of their world. I needed a partner who could match my ambition, who could understand that sometimes love means supporting someone's dreams even when it's difficult. We were just incompatible from the start. It took me 8 years to figure that out, but at least I finally did. And yeah, it hurts that he found someone else so quickly, but that just proves my point. He was never really invested in making our marriage work. He was just looking for any woman who would appreciate his basic level of effort. Claire, his new wife, is probably perfectly content being married to a construction worker. Good for her. Some women don't need more than that. But I'm a doctor, and I deserve someone who can match my level of success and ambition. I'm not bitter about how things turned out. I'm disappointed, sure, but I'm not bitter. Ross got what he wanted. Someone who thinks he's amazing for doing the bare minimum. And I got what I wanted, my medical degree and a career that actually matters. The only thing I regret is wasting 8 years of my life with someone who was never going to be enough for me in the long run. I should have ended things sooner, before I got so invested in trying to make it work with the wrong person. But you live and you learn, right? Next time, I'll know better than to settle for someone just because they're willing to support my dreams. Next time, I'll find someone who has dreams of their own that match mine. I'm 29 years old, I'm a doctor, and my whole life is ahead of me. Ross can have his suburban happiness with his little graphic designer wife. I'm destined for bigger things than that. At least, that's what I keep telling myself every night when I come home to my shared apartment and eat another frozen dinner alone, wondering how everything went so wrong when I did everything right.
If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.